So after many months of waiting, the Canon EOS R5 and the R6 have finally showed up at my doorstep. And there's been a lot going on with these cameras, and I mean, there's been a lot going on in the world in general, but there's been a lot of delays, and the R5 was supposed to start shipping back in at the end of July, and the R6 in August. But a lot of people are still waiting for their R5s and R6s. I could have actually gotten the R5 a few weeks ago, but I wanted to test these two cameras at the same time, and finally I was able to get my hands on both of them. So today we're going to take a look at these two cameras, and we're also going to compare them with their older brother, the EOS R. Although the R5 isn't the direct replacement of the R had the same sensor from the 5D Mark IV, and since the R5 is like the unofficial 5D Mark V, we're gonna see exactly how much the image quality has improved. And then we're also going to compare these two cameras with what I think is their closest competitors right now, the Sony A7R IV and the A7 III. A lot of you have been asking me about this, and I'm also very curious as well. Until just a couple years ago, the reasons to choose Sony cameras were pretty clear. They had the most advanced autofocus, they had the best sensors, and they were the only ones selling full-frame mirrorless cameras, so they basically dominated the market. But just in this past year, Canon really started to catch up on the autofocus, and they made them even better with these new cameras. And although Canon was never really known for their things like low light performance or dynamic range, but is that even an issue anymore with these new sensors? Well, we're gonna find out today, and as you can see, there's a lot to talk about, so let's get started. First, let's take a look at the hardware. At a first glance, the R5 and the R6 aren't that different from the R, but they now basically have everything that we've been asking for. The joystick, another dial on the back, and dual card slots. Pretty much the only difference between the R5 and the R6 on the outside is the top LCD screen on the R5. The R6 has the more traditional looking mode dial like on the RP. And also the R6 has two SD card slots, while the R5 has one Type B CF Express slot and one SD slot. And the R5 screen resolution is the same as the R at 2.1 million dots. Interestingly, the R6 has the lowest resolution screen at 1.6 million dots. Compare that to Sony though, the A7R4 screen resolution is only 1.4 million dots, and the A7 III about 920,000. The viewfinder resolution on the R5 has also been increased to 5.76 million dots from 3.69 on the EOS R. And the R6 also has the same resolution as the R, but the R5 and the R6's viewfinders have 0.76 magnification, while the R's is 0.71. The A7R4's viewfinder has the same resolution as the R5's at 5.76 million dots, and the A7 III has the lowest resolution viewfinder at 2.36 million dots. The R5 is the heaviest camera here at 738 grams, the R6 is 680 grams, and 660 grams for the R. The A7R4 is actually 5 grams heavier than the EOS R at 665 grams, and the A7 III weighs 650 grams. When you just grab the cameras by themselves, the R5 definitely feels heavier, but with the lens attached, it's very hard to tell the difference. Overall, I really like the new body designs. I love the new buttons and dials. All the things that I didn't like on the EOS R are gone, and all the things that I did like are even better now. I mean, things like the joystick and the dual card slots are not something that everyone needs, but for this price range, I think they should definitely have them, no question about that. I'm just very glad that Canon didn't take them out on the R6 like they usually do with the 6Ds. Canon's been always great with camera layouts and ergonomics, and for mirrorless cameras, I feel like this is pretty close to perfect now. And if you've known me for a while, you know I don't say that lightly. I mean, I still like my Sony cameras, but you hold one of these in your hands just for like 2 minutes and you go back to the A7 III, it's almost infuriating that these are designed for the same species of life forms. But there are some things that I like better on the Sony as well. I like having the power switch next to the shutter button on the right side, so I don't always have to use my left hand. And I know this is becoming gradually the lesser popular opinion now, but I still like the Sony's flippy screen better than Canon's fully articulating screen, at least for shooting photos. For shooting videos, I do like Canon's screen better, but I don't always use the same cameras for photos and videos nowadays. Sony recently went with the fully articulating screen for the A7S III and the A7C, but I feel like those are the more appropriate screen designs for those cameras because they're more designed for video. And I'm not sure what Sony's gonna do for the A7 IV, but I hope they keep the same screen design, but you know, that's just me and you obviously can't make everyone happy. Now, before we dive into the image comparisons, I want to take a quick look at the specs on paper and the price differences. The R5 is the most expensive camera here at $3,900, if you can even buy one, that is. And the A7R4's price is $3,500, but I've seen it a bit lower time to time. And the R6 is $2,500, the A7 III is $2,000, and the EOS R is $1,800. The A7R4 has 61 megapixels, the R5 has 45, 30 for the EOS R, 24 for the A7 III, and 20 for the R6. The native ISO sensitivity is 100 to 32,000 on the A7R4, 100 to 40,000 on the EOS R, 100 to 51,200 on the A7 III and the R5, and 100 to 102,400 on the R6. So the A7R4 has the highest resolution sensor but the lowest native ISO range, which makes sense. When I tested the camera a few months ago, I found out that even at 61 megapixels, the low light performance was very close to the EOS R, which has 30 megapixels, which again makes sense because that sensor is more than 4 years old now. And the A7 III has been pretty much the gold standard when it comes to low light performance in this price range at 24 megapixels. But now the R6 has entered the game, and I don't know if Canon ever confirmed this, but I believe this is the same sensor from the 1DX Mark III, which I have not tried in person, but the 1DX line always had amazing low light performance due to the lower megapixel count. Can you tell the difference between 20 and 24 megapixels? Is the R6's dynamic range just as good as the A7 III's? We'll find out in a minute. The R5 I think is going to be the most interesting one in the mix because it has 45 megapixels, so about 16 less than the A7R4, but does it perform that much better in low light? Is the dynamic range better? Because if they are better, I believe it will be a much better all-rounder camera than the Sony, since realistically, those things should matter much more to most people than the difference of 45 and 61 megapixels, and the R5 can also shoot a lot faster at 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter or up to 20 with the electronic shutter, while the A7R4 can only do 7 or 10 frames per second if you shoot compressed RAW. But the A7R4 is cheaper. I mean, I'm not sure how much of that difference really matters in this price range, but maybe you can use that money to get yourself another hard drive to store all your 120 megabyte RAW files. Okay, finally, the image quality. Let's start with some simple low light tests. Since we have 5 different cameras, I'll just quickly go over the images and we'll compare them one at a time to show them in more detail. And I've been saying this all the time, but all these cameras perform very well in low light. People really don't give the EOS R enough credit for its image quality, but with these modern digital cameras, you really have to push them to the extreme to see any meaningful differences. Yes, it's not as good as the A7 III, but it does have 6 more megapixels, so you just have to choose what works best for you. Here they are at ISO 25600, and this is when you start to see the differences a bit more clearly. But some things might surprise you. As expected, the A7R4 performs almost as well as the EOS R, but here it slightly falls behind. When it comes to high ISO performance, the A7R4 is definitely the worst performer here, but again, it still does quite well for a 61 megapixel sensor. But what really surprised me was how close the R5's images were to the R6 and the A7 III's. The R6 does perform better, but I really thought I would see a much bigger difference with a 20 megapixel sensor on the R6. Comparing the R6 to the A7 III, these images are very close. We're really splitting hairs at this point. I've been looking at these images for many days, but I couldn't really decide which one is better. I mean, the A7 III does have 4 more megapixels, so if everything else is equal, maybe it is the better performer if that means anything to you. Here's ISO 51,000 6200, and we're in the expanded range now for the EOS R and the A7R4. The A7R4 struggles a bit here, but the rest still did pretty well. I think the R6 actually does a little bit better than the A7 III here, but again, very close. Here's the A7 III and the R6 again at ISO 100 2400. And I think if I had to pick a winner, I'm not sure if this will even show up on YouTube, but I'm seeing some subtle lines and green spots on the A7 III's images. While the noise level was quite similar, I didn't see any of those issues on the R6. So with low light performance, if you put the A7 III and the R6 at 10 and the A7R4 at 1, I would say the R5 is somewhere around 7 or 8 and the EOS R around 4. But you know, like I said, these are really extreme cases, and under normal circumstances and normal lighting, all these cameras should perform pretty closely. But the main takeaway I think here is that the R5 sensor performs really well despite having such high resolution. Dynamic range test was even more boring. Recovering the shadows, they all did great, and only the EOS R showed a bit more noticeable noise, and the A7R4 was not too far behind. The A7 III and the R5 and the R6 seemed pretty equal to me. But since the R5 has more resolution, it just showed a bit more detail in the shadows. Recovering the highlights was a similar story. Here, I'm looking at these panels to see how much of these textures and patterns were retained in the files, and again, they all did pretty well, but only the EOS R was a bit behind. If you look at the R5's and the R's images side by side, you can see the lines are more clearly visible on the R5, while the shades are much more even on the R. But what about sharpness? Can you tell the difference between 61 and 45 megapixels or between 24 and 20? People ask me all the time, how many megapixels do you need? And I always say that if you need to ask, you probably don't need that many. I mean, more is obviously better, but the difference in numbers don't always translate perfectly in the real world results. So for this, I decided to do a blind test. I downsampled all the images into the same size and changed the file names to see if I can figure out which cameras they were from just by looking at the files. And please take these results with a grain of salt because I'm not using the same lens for the Sony and Canon cameras. I'm using Sony and Canon 24-105 f4, and I shot them both at 5.6 because although they're both very sharp lenses, they seem to perform better at 5.6 than at f4. And could I tell the difference? Well, after closely examining these images for over an hour, yes, I was able to guess which cameras these files were from. But it was only because I was looking at them side by side and was able to compare which was sharper and work out which is which by deduction. It was always relatively easy to pick out the A7R4's image from the bunch, but the rest were much harder. Here's the R5 next to the R and the R6. I think we can all agree that the R5's image is the sharpest, but does it look 50% sharper than the R as the numbers say? Does it look 2.5 times sharper than the R6? Probably not. So if you want an EOS R or the RP and you want to upgrade to the R6 but are worried about the drop in resolution, unless you really just need to have a 30 megapixel sensor or you just don't want to spend the extra money, which is a valid reason, I think the upgrade might be worth it because you gain so much on everything else. With the R5 and the A7R4, again, yes, the A7R4's images are a bit sharper, but the R5 performs better in low light and the dynamic range is just as good or if not better. What might actually appeal to a lot of people though is the file size. The A7R4's 61 megapixel uncompressed RAW files are over 120 megabytes each. The R5's 45 megapixel RAW files are only about 45 to 50 megabytes. So the A7R4 has about 34% more resolution, but its files are almost 2.5 times bigger. The A7 III's RAW files are also about the same size as the R5's, and the R6's RAW files only about 20 megabytes. So again, only about 20% increase in sharpness, same dynamic range and low light performance, but the Sony's files are 2.5 times bigger. I mean, memory cards and hard drives are pretty cheap nowadays, but depending on how much you shoot, this can really speed up your workflow. So yeah, it seems like Canon has finally caught up with Sony on the image quality. Overall, I'm really impressed by the R5's performance here, delivering very close performance as the A7 III and the R6 with almost 20 more megapixels. It is the most expensive camera here, but I think it offers the best balance of everything. If you don't need the highest resolution sensor, but if you shoot in different environments where you can't always control the lighting, the R6 will be great for that, and it will also provide the fastest workflow. Next, we're going to take a look at the video quality. This is where all the buzz is right now. Do these cameras overheat? And if they do, are the videos any good at least? Because like I've been saying all year, Canon doesn't exactly have the best track record on delivering their video specs in the recent years. Well, the R5 can shoot 8K and 4K in DCI or UHD formats, 8K up to 30p and 4K up to 60 or 120p in high frame rate mode. You can only shoot 8K in RAW or ALL-I formats with a CF Express card in the slot, but you can still record it in IPB on an SD card. There's also the 4K high quality mode, which has to be enabled on a separate screen like the high frame rate mode. Enable it, the movie recording options change to 4K only in 24 or 30p in ALL-I or IPB. The R6's video options are much simpler. It can shoot up to 4K 60 and 1080p up to 60 or up to 120 in high frame rate mode. There are no RAW or ALL-I options, and everything can only be shot in IPB format. Also, there is no high quality 4K on the R6. Here are some screenshots from these videos. My computer was struggling to play even one of these videos at a time, so this was the only way to show them side by side. The 1080 video is zoomed in about 300% here, and the 8K video is downsized by about 30% to match the frame here. Again, watching this on YouTube probably won't do this justice, but you can clearly see the difference in the resolution. What's interesting here is how much sharper the high quality mode 4K is compared to the normal mode. That's because from what I understand, the high quality 4K is basically a downsampled version of the 8K video. What's a little disappointing though is I think the new standard 4K is a little softer than the 4K from the EOS R. But at least with the R5 or the R6, you can shoot at full width without crop. Unless you're going to be cropping your videos, this might be okay, but still disappointing. Compared to the Sony cameras, the Sony videos were sharper than the standard 4K as expected, but the best one was still the high quality 4K from the R5. And do these cameras overheat? Well, I think we all know the answer to that by now, but I tested it anyway because I was just curious. I made sure the cameras were updated to the latest firmwares and started rolling just to see how long they would last. While shooting 8K, the R5 lasted 22 minutes and 26 seconds before it stopped recording. And I think that's about what everyone else is getting. While shooting high quality 4K, it was able to shoot a full 30-minute clip, and then it was able to shoot for about 10 more minutes before it shut down. I mean, you might say 20 or 40 minutes may not be that bad, but the bigger problem here is the cooling time. This isn't like the recording limit where it stops recording and you just press the button and it starts going again. Once the camera overheats, if you want to get the same recording time, you have to let the camera cool down completely for over 2 or 3 hours. If you keep stopping the recording before it overheats, then you can actually keep going for a lot longer. But once it does overheat, you have to wait several hours, or you can record 5 or 10 minutes at a time at most. So it's quite usable if you only shoot shorter clips at a time, but it's definitely not for longer videos like for interviews, events, or performances. It's a little too risky and unpredictable at this point. I don't think a lot of people will be using the 8K or even the high quality 4K in any sort of professional environments. So is the 8K just a novelty item for hobbyists? Well, it kind of is, but I'm not even sure exactly how many people will be willing to deal with the file size. I mean, get this, a 5-minute 8K IPB recording is about 18 gigabytes. And that's just in IPB. In RAW, A 5-minute footage can go over 120 gigabytes. And these CF Express Type B cards aren't exactly cheap. So I guess what I want to say is don't buy the R5 thinking that you're going to be shooting 8K all the time instead of the 4K or the 1080. Think of the 8K like the boost mode. You have to use it sparingly or you're going to run into trouble. But on a more positive note, these are the first Canon full-frame mirrorless cameras that can shoot uncropped 4K, so that's pretty exciting. I feel like everyone was disappointed because all the focus was on the 8K, but like I've been saying over and over again, don't get your hopes up too much when it comes to Canon video specs. I mean, I love Canon, but just always expect a minimum. Just use it as a 1080 or a 4K camera and you'll be fine. Next, let's talk about autofocus. I mean, it's pretty pointless to even compare these cameras anymore because they're all so good, and because technically the EOS R should be the worst performer here, but I owned that camera for almost 2 years, and in the past 2 years never have I felt that camera's autofocus was not good enough to get the jobs done. It was always able to get the shots I needed without any issues. And the newer system just improves upon that. If anything, I think the tracking is slightly smoother than before, but I didn't really see a noticeable difference. Compared to Sony, at least in terms of tracking and face and eye detection, I couldn't see any difference there either. All the cameras did really well on that. Newly added to the R5 and the R6, the Canons now have animal eye autofocus, which unlike Sony's, works on a lot more animals such as birds, fish, and even turtles, not just dogs and cats. Unfortunately, I was only able to test this on my dog, and at least on him, I think Sony's IAF worked a little bit better. Canon also did great, but it seemed to lose his eyes more often than the Sony. I assume things like this will get a lot better over time like human IAF did, but things are looking very promising, and unless you're a wildlife shooter, I don't think the autofocus performance is something you need to be worried about when you're choosing between Canon and Sony anymore. So, what's the conclusion then? Well, I think it's pretty fair to say at this point that these are the best full-frame cameras that Canon has ever made. The A7R IV does have more resolution, but the R5 offers much better low-light performance, almost as good as the A7 III while offering 21 more megapixels. The R5 does cost about $500 to $700 more than the A7R IV right now, but in reality, I feel like the R5 is more of a hybrid between the A7R IV and the A9 II because it can shoot much faster frame rates and the file size is a lot more manageable. So I feel like it's going to appeal to a much wider range of photographers. But obviously $3,900 is still a lot of money, and if that's out of your budget, the R6 basically offers everything the R5 does, but only with a lower resolution sensor for $1,400 less. The R6's image quality didn't necessarily blow me away though. I thought with the 20 megapixel sensor, I thought the low light performance would be so much better than the R5, but they were actually quite similar. Not saying the images were terrible by any means, but that just shows you how amazing the R5 sensor is. Is the R6 worth $500 to $700 more than the A7 III? Well, if you're only interested in image quality and if you don't care about anything else, probably not. But the R6 does have some advantages as well. It can shoot a little bit faster than the A7 III. It has 2 UHS 2 card slots instead of just 1. It has more video options, and arguably the body just feels a lot better. If you already have an EOS R or the RP, whether you should upgrade to the R6 should depend entirely on your budget and your needs. I would say for most people, spending the extra $1,000 or $1,500 just to get better dynamic range and low light performance while giving up 6 or 10 megapixels is probably not worth it. But you can't really put a price value on things like having a backup card slot or the joystick or the autofocus working a split second faster to get the shot you need. Again, I'm just really glad that Canon didn't take out some of these key pro features from the R6 to protect the R5. And if you think about it, the R6 is basically a mirrorless 1DX Mark III for less than half of the price. So if you think about it that way, then the value seems really amazing. For video, for 1080, it really doesn't matter which camera you use, but if your job is to shoot longer 4K videos of events and weddings and interviews or performances, I feel like the Sony is still the more reliable option for that. But if you don't need to constantly shoot anything for more than 30 minutes at a time, the R5's 8K will provide the best image quality as long as you're willing to deal with the big file sizes. And let me just say this one thing before ending this video. Like what a lot of other reviewers said, I feel like the R5 really suffered from Canon's bad marketing and strategy. All they really had to do was to come up with a 45 megapixel camera with decent autofocus and dynamic range and low light performance, which they have done, but they got a bit too carried away with 8K, which probably only a fraction of people will use. For me, this is a great camera with or without the 8K, so putting all the focus on that I think was a clear mistake on Canon's part. Also, the R6 didn't get as much press as the R5 because it doesn't have 8K, but I feel like this is an amazing value and I wouldn't be surprised if they sell a lot more R6s than the R5s. So which camera will I choose and which cameras will I recommend? Well, I feel like in 2020, choosing between Canon and Sony has now more to do with your personal preference on your lens selection or body design more than things like image quality or autofocus performance. You know, until just a few years ago, it was the matter of choosing between Sony or DSLRs, but now that they're all mirrorless cameras, the size and weight are all about the same, the image quality or the autofocus are about the same, so the playing field is much more even now. So pretty much all you have to do is choose the brand you like and buy the camera you can afford and go out there and shoot and stop watching camera reviews. So that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you have any more questions about these cameras, just leave a comment down below, and if you are interested in purchasing any of these cameras, I'll also include the links in the descriptions. So thank you again, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.